Today is November 7th, 2024. I'm recording this right in the aftermath of the US presidential elections. I was asked before the elections, obviously after the elections, what difference is this going to make in regards to US foreign policy, or even domestic policy for that matter? And the answer is absolutely nothing. If the special interests that drive US foreign and domestic policy have not changed, then a change in the White House or a change in Congress is not going to change anything either. And as a matter of fact, I've already done a video about this. I will put the link in the video description below and in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Who really controls US foreign policy? I explain all about continuity of agenda. I use the encirclement of Russia from 1993 to 2024 as an example. And I show how each and every president played their role, working their way toward this proxy war being fought against Russia right now in Ukraine, including President Donald Trump during his first administration. And so the only thing that is going to change are the lies that we are told as to why things are not changing, and the excuses whoever so happens to support the US president at any given time make for why their candidate that they voted into office is not doing what they promised to do during their campaign. That is the only thing that will change. Now, the real reason I am making this video is actually to read this article that I wrote recently for New Eastern Outlook. Israeli strikes demonstrates limits of Western military might. And it's an example of a wider shift in military, economic, and political power away from the collective West led by the US toward a multipolar world. And if you see the United States withdrawing from conflicts, it is not because they have changed their mind about waging war against the entire world. It is because they are reaching the physical limits in their ability to do so. They want to pursue global primacy. They are reaching physical limits in the pursuit of that global primacy. And if you read articles like this from the New York Times, this was all the way back in 1992, but there's also government documents from the end of World War II, all saying the same thing. US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in the Middle East, not anywhere, not strong allies who have independent foreign policy, and not adversaries. And down here, it talks all about a world dominated by one superpower, the United States, obviously, whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. Doesn't that sound like what every single president or Congress member in terms of foreign policy promise the American public in one way or another, in one package or another, under one brand or the other? So it's important to keep all of this in mind. Now, I'm going to read this article. I'm going to add additional information when and if necessary. I want to point out that as we watch this conflict escalate during the Biden administration, we have to remember that a lot of the groundwork for this was laid during the previous Trump administration, and before that, the Obama administration, and obviously the Bush administration, the so-called global war on terror that raged for 20 years, again, regardless of who was president, after President Bush kicked it into motion. I will begin. Israel's most recent missile strikes on Iran reveal the limits to conventional Western military power in the Middle East, reflecting wider limits globally. And I think we are already seeing those limits as the proxy war in Ukraine plays out. While Israel's Air Force conducted a sophisticated, large-scale operation requiring well-trained, well-coordinated personnel, as well as capable air-launched, long-range precision-guided missiles, a combination of Iranian defensive capabilities and constraints on Western, including Israeli military-industrial production, limited the results. Whatever you want to say about Israel, has a well-trained, well-equipped Air Force, and they are capable of striking at targets in Iran. They're capable of creating quite a bit of damage if they were engaged in all-out war with Iran. But because of the limits of Western military industrial production, which includes Israel, they are unable to sustain these types of strikes, and even conducting these strikes are problematic. But I will get into all of that in this article here in just a moment. While Israel and its U.S. sponsors are capable of larger scale military operations, inflicting greater damage on Iran, almost certainly, this would be within the context of open warfare. Warfare the U.S.-Israeli forces and their combined industrial power would struggle to sustain. Again, look at what is happening in Ukraine. Doubts may exist regarding Iranian resolve and resilience and whether it and its allies could outlast and outfight U.S.-Israeli forces, short of either or both the U.S. and Israel resorting to nuclear weapons. Even if the U.S. and its proxies, including Israel, were to prevail over Iran in the Middle East, it may come at the cost of forfeiting Washington's pursuit of primacy elsewhere around the globe, including in Ukraine versus Russia and the Asia-Pacific region versus China. There was a lot of talk before this most recent U.S. presidential election that President Trump was going to cut off Ukraine, abandon Ukraine, but we can see that that is already happening. Even before he takes office, we can see Ukraine being abandoned. It's not a matter of political will. It's a matter of America's physical ability to sustain large-scale, long-term, protracted, intense warfare as is taking place in Ukraine right now. If the United States wants to continue pursuing global primacy, including over the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific region, they have to be very careful how much they invest in this proxy war in Ukraine. They are reaching the physical limits to their ability to try to cling to global primacy. Let's talk about this escalation toward war. And this is an escalation toward war, again, especially regarding Iran itself, that has been ongoing since the Bush administration. And again, regardless of whether it was Obama or Trump or Biden, this has all continued uninterrupted in a single direction, regardless of who sat in the White House and regardless of who sat and controlled Congress. Long-standing U.S. policy seeks to use Israel to provoke war with Iran, absolving Washington of responsibility while creating a possible pretext for Washington itself to wade into the conflict once it begins. And that's if they want to, if they feel it's necessary or possible to. Despite Israel lacking the conventional military power required to fight and win a war against Iran, Israel has conducted a long list of provocations to draw Iran into a conflict nonetheless, specifically to fulfill this U.S. foreign policy objective. And of course, I'm referring to this. And this is not the only paper that has talked about these policy options toward Iran, but it is the most concise and obvious and thorough explanation of these policy options. This 2009 Brookings Institution paper. The Brookings Institution is funded by the U.S. government, the largest arms manufacturers in the United States. Which path to Persia? Options for a new American strategy toward Iran. We have the table of contents. It talks about everything. U.S. sanctions on Iran. They talked about the nuclear deal before it was ever even announced to the public. They talk about all of these military operations, including an Iraq-style invasion. And here, leave it to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. That's the one I'm going to focus on. Also, notice that they talk about overthrowing the government from within, backing opposition, and even listed terrorist groups to overthrow the Iranian government. I want to look at this option here. Leave it to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. It says, as is the case of American airstrikes against Iran, the goal of this policy option would be to destroy key Iranian nuclear facilities, and I would add into that Iranian ballistic missile production facilities now, in the hopes that doing so would significantly delay Iran's acquisition of an indigenous nuclear weapons capability. And I would also add now into that the expansion of Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. However, in this case, an added element could be that the United States would encourage and perhaps even assist, and it's inferred that this assistance would be covert, the Israelis in conducting the strikes themselves, in the expectation that both international criticism and Iranian retaliation would be deflected away from the United States and onto Israel, which is exactly what the United States is doing to Russia right now through Ukraine. So it is the exact same policy, just in the Middle East. Instead of using Ukraine as a proxy, they're using Israel as a proxy. Instead of waging proxy war against Russia, they are waging proxy war against Iran. And again, the goal is to establish American primacy over an entire region of the planet. So the proxy war in Ukraine is part of controlling Europe, including Russia. And this proxy war in the Middle East is obviously designed to give the US primacy over the Middle East. Continuing with my article, exchanges of missile strikes between Israel and Iran began in April 2024 when Israel attacked the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing military personnel and civilians. This was an act of war. It triggered a chain reaction of strikes, assassinations, and retaliations documented in a timeline laid out by the New York Times. That's right here. And the links to all of this will be in the video description below. Timeline, the Israel-Iran shadow war moves into the open. And if you look at the very first item mentioned, it is an Israeli strike, not Iran. So even the New York Times is admitting that Israel is the provocateur here. Iran's first retaliatory strike in April 2024 consisted of a barrage of drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles 2 weeks after its consulate was attacked and after notifying the United States days prior, giving the US and its regional partners ample time to coordinate efforts to intercept most of the incoming weapons. And the whole point of this attack was as a warning, as a demonstration of Iranian capabilities. Iran's second retaliatory strike in early October 2024 consisted, and this is the strike that Israel responded to with this most recent Israeli attack on Iran. So Iran's second retaliatory strike in early October 2024 consisted of between 180 and 200 ballistic missiles launched with little warning, overwhelming Israeli air defenses and inflicting significant damage to at least one Israeli airbase, according to the Western media. So not Iranian media, Western media admits this. In the immediate aftermath of the missile strikes, the Israeli government and the Western media downplayed the attacks, but as satellite imagery emerged, it became very clear that many of these Iranian missiles found their target and they did damage. They caused damage. You can see the top of this building blown off right here. And you could see marks on the runways. They show the location of the airbase struck. The two Iranian retaliatory strikes represented incremental escalation, each designed to serve as a demonstration and warning regarding Iranian capabilities, including Iran's ability to target Israel with an array of weapons, overwhelm Israeli air defenses, and inflict damage at will on Israeli military targets, all of it falling short of a full-scale attack. In other words, Iran could launch a much larger, more devastating attack. They have chosen not to. They are managing escalation very carefully, and this is something that Russia itself has done all throughout multiple conflicts and provocations engineered and driven by, ultimately, the United States, whether it's in Syria or Ukraine. Israel has responded to each Iranian retaliation with additional attacks consisting of air-launched long-range precision-guided missiles. So Iran is responding to Israeli aggression, and then Israel responds by striking Iran again. And then after each strike, Iran has refused to retaliate a second time. So that the first round of exchanges in April, after Israel carried out a very small-scale missile attack on Iran considered the matter closed. It did not retaliate. It waited until multiple provocations before launching another round of missiles at Israel. So it's very important to keep track of who is actually provoking this conflict and who is exhibiting restraint to try to prevent a wider conflict. Such missiles are launched far beyond Iranian airspace, likely in Iraq after transiting Jordanian airspace, with attacks on Syrian air defenses and claims of having transited Syrian airspace used to spare Jordan diplomatic complications. It would be extremely risky for Israel to fly through Syrian airspace. Syria has air defense systems capable of targeting and destroying Israeli aircraft. They would do almost anything to avoid that possibility, even if it's a very small possibility. But they don't want to overfly Jordan, even though it is a willing US proxy at the moment. So it would like to convince the world that they flew through Syrian airspace. So they attack Syrian air defense systems regardless of what damage is inflicted, they will claim that was because they were transiting Syrian airspace, hostile airspace. So nobody can complain. Syria tried to shoot them down. They managed to get through unscathed, and they carried out their attack on Iran. I believe that it was likely a diversion. However, we'll never know. It should be noted, however, that it was acknowledged that Israel used Jordanian airspace to intercept Iranian missiles during that first Iranian retaliatory barrage in April of this year. While Israeli missiles managed to strike targets in Iran, the air operation required was complex. It involved dozens of aircraft and highly trained pilots, and for the second larger strike involved scores of missiles, over 50 missiles, according to leaked U.S. intelligence assessments. So we remember this intelligence assessment being leaked. They had a picture of the document, and they talk about the number of long-range missiles Israel was handling. It was up to 56 missiles, I believe, 16 Golden Horizon and 40 ROX missiles. Despite the large, complex operation, Israel launched, alleged damage dealt to Iranian targets, even according to Israeli sources, was minimal. Israel itself claimed to have hit up to 3 S-300 air defense systems. However, the term systems likely means individual pieces of equipment from among entire S-300 batteries, which consist of several launchers, radar stations, a command center, and power generators. As was the case with Israel's April missile strikes, these systems were likely radar sets, so maybe 3 radar sets. Maybe adjacent equipment was damaged or even destroyed, but when they say 3 systems, it's highly unlikely they mean they have destroyed 3 entire S-300 batteries. NBC News and the New York Times both published satellite images of buildings at Iranian military and alleged missile production sites damaged by Israeli strikes. So let's just take a quick look at that. They have this image here. I really can't see what they're talking about. They have this image here, a before and after. I could see that maybe 2 or 3 buildings here were damaged. This was the before, and this is the after. And then they have this. So out of all of these buildings, they have this one building here that looks pretty severely damaged, if not destroyed. Out of over a dozen visible buildings at an alleged missile production site, one appears severely damaged. A military base allegedly struck by Israel appears to show perhaps 3 out of over 20 visible structures damaged. Because of the complex operations required by Israeli warplanes to launch these missiles at targets in Iran, well over 1,000 kilometers from Israeli territory, and the fact that Israeli warplanes must enter into foreign airspace to launch these missiles, missile strikes on Iran are risky and less sustainable than Iran's own use of ground-launched ballistic missiles from Iranian territory capable of reaching targets anywhere in Israel. So if we're going to have this conflict between Israel and Iran without U.S. intervention, Iran has the advantage. They have these ground-launched ballistic missiles. They fire from their territory at targets anywhere in Israel. Israel, to attack Iran, needs to conduct these complex air operations into foreign airspace, launch these missiles, attempt to do their damage, and then return home. So it's very clear that the advantage here is Iran. And we can't even say that, well, Israeli missiles may be fewer in number and it's more complex, but they're more accurate. It looked like Iran's missiles were plenty accurate. Iran is rumored to have over 3,000 ballistic missiles. I've cited Western media for these claims. Only a percentage of those missiles likely have the ability to reach Israel. The question is, what percentage? 3,000 missiles. Only a small percentage, I think, or a smaller percentage of these missiles can actually reach Israel. The rest would be used for, say, striking U.S. military bases in Iraq or Syria, much closer to Iranian territory. Iran has extensive missile production facilities, and it was reported by Reuters. I've cited this article. This was from back in July 2024. Exclusive satellite photos show Iran expanding missile production, sources say. Israeli sources cited by Euronews, that is this article here. Tehran's missile count significantly depleted after strike on Israel, reports claim. Well, let's just listen to these Israeli claims and let's just consider them at face value first. They claim that Iran has already exhausted a third of its high-grade missiles, leaving about 400 top-tier missiles in its arsenal. That's still a lot of missiles considering the damage done so far. However, this number, if true, likely represents a much larger number than Israel's top-tier missiles capable of reaching Iran in these complex air operations that Israel has launched twice now. Even the US, with its vastly greater military capabilities than Israel, has found its position in the Middle East increasingly vulnerable, with Iran and its allies repeatedly demonstrating an ability to strike at US bases in Iraq and Syria. Both the US and Israel suffer from a critical shortage of air defense missiles required to defend against Iranian drones, cruise, and ballistic missiles, further tilting the military balance of power in the region in Iran's favor. Considering the shifting balance of military power in the region, the US and its proxies are forced with a decision: acknowledge limits to Western military power and influence over the region, or continue escalating toward war. Because the US is able to employ Israel as a proxy, and by doing so avoid the direct consequences of failure, it enables and encourages Israel to continue expanding a multi-front conflict with Iran and its allies, including Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Ansar Allah in Yemen, despite the growing costs and risks to Israel itself. If you look at Israeli foreign policy, it is not unlike Ukrainian policy. It is engaged in a self-destructive war. It really has no chance of winning, at least not on its own. Now let's talk about the extreme desperation this creates, a policy like this creates, and the danger that emanates from it. Israel and its US sponsors have the means of inflicting greater damage on Iran, but only within the context of open war, or worse, nuclear war. Israel could use the summation of its long-range air-launched missiles on targets in Iran in waves of attacks, just like they've done twice now, with US participation utilizing a much larger arsenal of air and sea-launched missiles, like cruise missiles or JASSM. Those are air-launched missiles, also capable of striking Iran. These strikes could be expanded beyond military targets to include energy infrastructure and industry, undermining Iran's economy and possibly destabilizing the nation socioeconomically. And they could do this in conjunction with their constant efforts to stir up unrest inside Iran and overthrow the government that way. However, the US has a finite number of these standoff weapons, and obviously so does Israel. And should they be used in large-scale war with Iran, either by itself or by transferring them to Israel, it will take years to replace depleted stockpiles, forfeiting perceived US leverage over China in the Asia-Pacific region or over Russia in Eastern Europe. Now let me explain that. The US could escalate. They could jointly attack Iran side by side with Israel. They could launch all of their cruise missiles, their long-range air-launched missiles at targets all across Iran. They could create devastating damage. They could even endanger the stability of Iran's society, economy, and government. The problem with this option, however, is that by doing so, they have depleted their stockpiles that they need to constantly threaten and maintain leverage over China in the Asia-Pacific region. And also, if they plan on escalating rather than divesting from Ukraine, they will have no ability to do this because they are using assets they would either use against Russia or against China. Even just having them and using the threat of using them against either or, they will no longer have this option, and it will undermine their pursuit of primacy globally. So it is a difficult choice they're faced with, but it is a difficult, irrational, illegal, immoral policy to begin with. Beyond this, both the US and Israel possess nuclear weapons. Israel is thought to possess its own arsenal of missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons, including the Jericho-3 intercontinental ballistic missile. They're also reportedly testing a Jericho-4 missile, a much more capable missile, reportedly. Because the US has deliberately invested in maintaining plausible deniability regarding Israeli actions, despite facilitating every aspect of Israeli actions, there may be a temptation to utilize Israeli nuclear weapons as the window of opportunity closes on the successful use of conventional military power against Iran. And by this I mean the US itself doesn't want to use nuclear weapons because many of the adversaries that it is facing off against have large nuclear arsenals. They can retaliate, and there will be consequences for the US if they do this. The whole point of having a proxy is for the proxy to absorb those consequences, in this case, Israel. The chances of using conventional military power in the Middle East to obtain primacy is the window of opportunity is closing to do this. Perhaps using nuclear weapons could deliver a devastating blow while maintaining the conventional military capabilities the US needs to continue threatening Russia and China. And they would have Israel carry this strike out on their behalf. They would claim that they urged Israel to maintain restraint, but they didn't listen. They did it unilaterally, and they should suffer the consequences. They and themselves should suffer the consequences. That is a possibility. I don't know what the probability is of that, but it is definitely a possibility. We've already watched the US engage in unprecedented, extremely dangerous behavior, engage in extremely provocative escalations with Russia and China, also Iran, in recent years. So we can't actually rule that out. We have to keep this in mind as a possibility. Israel could use nuclear weapons on Iran, setting back both its nuclear program and the production of ballistic missiles, as well as civilian infrastructure and thus its economy, setting the entire nation back years, if not decades, and removing it for the foreseeable future as an otherwise immovable obstacle to US primacy over the Middle East. That is the bottom line. For Washington, the best part about this option is that while many would suspect US involvement behind the scenes, the US could officially deny any role and even claim it urged Israel to exercise restraint. This is exactly what they are doing regarding Israel as it brutalizes and wipes out and flattens Gaza and its entire civilian population. The US is saying, we are urging Israel to show restraint and to follow international law as it conducts these military operations. Israel clearly isn't. The US is enabling these military operations and the abuses taking place amid them, but it's claiming that it's urging Israeli restraint. So even though it's pretty obvious to everyone, they still are able to, in a way, maintain plausible deniability. At least they're trying to. They would do something very similar regarding Israeli provocations and the crossing of red lines regarding Iran. While Israel would face unprecedented consequences for the use of nuclear weapons, for Washington, the whole purpose of employing proxies is precisely to shift the consequences of US foreign policy onto another nation while enjoying that policy's benefits. So they will enjoy the benefits of Israel having destroyed Iranian military and economic infrastructure and capabilities, but it won't have to face the consequences of having done so. That would be Israel suffering those consequences. Israel is seen as expendable, just as Ukraine is, clearly. As extreme and reprehensible as this sounds, it should be remembered that the United States and Europe have enjoyed generations of primacy over the globe. This primacy is now in terminal decline. This has already driven the US and its partners to adopt extreme measures, including war and proxy war around the globe. This conflict between the US and Russia is so dangerous. This proxy war taking place in Ukraine is so dangerous, unprecedented. Nothing like this took place during the Cold War. And this is a reflection of America's terminal decline, its growing weakness, and how desperate it has become, despite the obvious conclusion being that this is an unsustainable policy that they need to abandon, but they refuse to. The ongoing war in Ukraine is a byproduct of this process, as is the escalating violence between Israel and Iran in the Middle East. Growing tensions between the US and China in the Asia-Pacific region are also a result of Washington attempting to reverse its declining primacy there. Large-scale war and even the use of nuclear weapons may seem unthinkable, but US desperation is unprecedented. Because desperation breeds danger, unprecedented desperation breeds unprecedented danger. While many have criticized Iran's patience and restraint regarding US-Israeli provocations, it is likely because Iran realizes time is on its side, unless it provides the US and its proxies an opportunity to justify exercising what few extreme options are capable of turning the tide back in the West's favor. So Iran perhaps could deliver a much more devastating strike on Israel, but they don't want to give Israel even the shadow of a possibility of justifying using nuclear weapons in response. The use of nuclear weapons the US could distance itself from. It would enjoy the benefits of Israel delivering devastating blows to Iran without having to suffer the consequences. And even though many people seem to think that the use of nuclear weapons is impossible, we have to remember that the only nation to use nuclear weapons against another nation has been the United States, and it did it twice at the end of World War II. So it seems unprecedented, but it isn't. The US has already done it. I believe the US is capable of doing it again. I believe their desperation is that great. And those actually driving US foreign policy, not in the White House, not in Congress, the unelected corporate financier interests on the board of directors, the shareholders of these Fortune 500 corporations, I believe they still feel they are sufficiently decoupled from the consequences of their actions. So they really don't see any reason not to. It's worth a try, especially if they're not going to face the consequences. So this is the problem in the Middle East. As promising as it seems that US primacy and meddling and warmongering around the globe is failing, yes, it is shifting toward a multipolar world, a more desirable world order, but is creating dangerous desperation among these special interests, and it could prompt them to do something unthinkable that would impact all of us and hurt all of our lives and have consequences for all of us. And I think just look at the recent health crisis we went through and how they pressured the world into upending everybody's lives and all of the damage and destruction that caused. So something to keep in mind. I will continue keeping an eye on this conflict in the Middle East. I would like to be wrong about the US presidential elections. I would like to think that this is an unprecedented moment in American history where finally a US president is not just another politician who lied to us and is now just going to continue doing as has been done year after year, administration after administration. I would love to think that that has changed, but I doubt it. But we'll keep an eye on it nonetheless. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all of the ways you can find and follow my work. My videos are on YouTube, Rumble, and Telegram. I'm also on X. In the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video, including the link to the article that I have been reading from. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up for any reason, feel free to skip them. They're not doing me any good. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no additional resources at all and you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes my work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.